Yeah. All right. So. Okay. So before the break, we saw parallel sampling, both like in terms of trying to parallelize methods, well, exact resampling methods, and also how to look at the categorical distribution, which is like the multinomial resampling building block, and derive ways to sample that would enable us to parallelize the resampling step in the particle filter. So the two lessons we learned, I think, at least, are that cumulative sums are fairly unstable on low precision floats, and therefore parallelizing the standard resampling schemes makes things unstable to the point that you end up with more bias in exact methods than you would in exact methods. And the other thing that we learned is that the either rejection sampling or the MCMC resampling need to run for at least log n to n steps for them to give you a proper resampling method. So like for them to actually reach the stationary distribution of your categorical resampling. Right. So this specific subsection of the power resampling is like, it's a bit more freestyle. So it's not something that is in the literature. I think like some of the ideas in there would make for like an early PhD student to have like a first go at both like the theory of particle filtering and also like understanding parallelism, resampling in general, and the analysis of Markov chains. So if you want to discuss it, like I'm happy to chat. I sorry won't be working on it myself, but yeah. So if we go back to categorical variables, multinomial resampling, we had this target distribution, which was just a product of weights. So it's an independent distribution, and we had like this independent Metropolis Hastings algorithm that converges in n steps. Well, typically like n times a constant, but the constant can actually depend on n. So it might be less than n, but say n steps. If you wanted to kind of improve on that, well, a standard way to think of it is to say, well, maybe like locality makes sense, right? So instead of proposing independently a new ancestor for each index, you can just propose, and so you can just propose particles that are next to you. All right. So that has at least one advantage. It's locality in the computational sense, right? So you're not moving the particles too far or copying them from memory slots that are like far from where you are currently. So you're just like looking at your neighbor and saying that, okay, let me just copy you, right? So that's one interesting thing. And another interesting thing is if you were to say, instead of considering the weights here, I am going to consider an ordered version of the weights, then it actually starts making sense from a statistical standpoint as well, right? Because like locality in the likelihood realm, you would have like a form of locality in terms of, well, monotonicity of your likelihood. And so like doing sampling in that is actually it's simpler than doing it in something that's like ragged, right? So like, for instance, you could think of, I don't know, here I'm saying Markov chain, like random walk, but you could think of doing it non-reversible. So if you if you use a non-reversible kernel, you can go back and forth fairly fast in the space, especially if the weights are sorted. Right. So we've been looking at the current categorical distribution, and something that might be thinking is, well, multinomial resampling is not that great. Everybody knows it. It has too much noise, and we prefer resampling schemes with less noise. So can we extend those ideas of MCMC rejection sampling to other types of resampling methods? And so the one example I want to kind of point at is the killing resampling, which is a fairly simple one to handle, right? And so how, like, let's try maybe like see if people have an idea. How would you implement the independent? Do you think of that?
The same except pre-proposed same location?
No, I mean there's a slight difference. But I mean one step is the same. The idea is essentially to see it as an interrupted rejection sampler, right? So you're saying with the probability given by the first mixture, I just keep my ancestor to be the same particle, right? Otherwise, I go on and I just sample from the multinomial using MCMC, right? That's in my opinion, it's a very natural way to do it, and it's like an interrupted rejection sampler, right? And so you can see this version, even though it doesn't have the same target distribution. Oops. So here, like you see, it's not even that like I'm sampling this and then I'm carrying on. It's that I'm skipping the loop altogether, right? And so you can kind of see that as a mixture between the rejection and the MCMC methods that we talked about before. What do you think about other resampling algorithms? So systematic, stratified. Do you have an opinion? Do you think it would be feasible? Why?
Because of the way it looks in the space of A is not suitable.
I think like the way it looks is not really a problem. What is the problem is that you actually express the distribution of the ancestors. So you need to write down the computation, the cumulative sums. So the stratas are defined with respect to the cumulative sums. And so even though you would be able to do it, you would end up with the same numerical issue. Right? So, but I mean, there are I think the SSP, for instance, does not require, does it require cumulative sums?
But SSP is so complicated.
Okay.
I doubt that it doesn't require any. Because I think this must be. There's no more complicated example scheme than.
Yeah. But I mean, fundamentally, if you're able to trace the mass function of your resampling algorithm, then you can do MCMC. That doesn't mean that it's going to be helpful if you need to compute the cumulative sums, which are unstable numerically, right? And so that's the only one I actually thought of that could be done easily. Does it make sense?
Actually, what we can actually do is to build up new resampling scheme, starting from the expression of A rather than U. And in that case, maybe I don't know, we can hope and find we have to give us video example. But
Yeah.
it's not from the U point of view that you are more or less constrained.
But if you go from the A point of view, then it's a bit easier to handle. Yeah.
I have some new example solution.
Yeah, but it's an interesting open question. Like it's not really clear what you can, if there are like better resamplings in the parallel context, right? So it's pretty clear just from that you can do killing. Is there like better stuff, right? I believe you can do residual, but it's very painful because the residual also so you can do a form of the residual where instead of like looking at the proportion, so you have to compute the normalized weight, right, to be able to understand how many particles you're going to keep from like how many deterministic offstrings you get. But you can also do it using the median, right? So there is a possibility of using medians instead of means pretty much everywhere, right? And then like medians are more stable to compute than averages, and so you can essentially modify algorithms in that respect. The systematic and stratified, I don't think so. But it's yeah.
Because I have a question that is, even in this case, the killing something, how do you get up about from algorithms?
You scan it.
It doesn't have to be normalized.
No. You just scan it.
So it doesn't have to be normalized?
Well, the weight for killing.
Definitely starts.
Yeah, there's the ratio, right?
Okay.
Yeah, so yeah. So no, it doesn't need to be normalized. Right. Another thing you can do is you can start thinking of copying from the past, so like perfect sampling of those efficiency chains. So like the problem we discussed earlier is that you need to stop the Markov chain at some point, right? And if you stop the Markov chain at some point, you're incurring the bias, right? And bias is fine numerically, but like if you're trying to do, say, particle efficiency, you really don't want that. And so instead of doing that, you can imagine doing a coupling based on like some monotonous. Well, you can implement a monotonous coupling to do perfect sampling from the multinomial in that case, right? Who is familiar with coupling from the past? Okay. So the general method, I mean, without talking about the theory. So when you have I'm not going to present it like from the past, present it forward. But so like you can imagine that you have a state space, finite state space, right, which is ordered. Okay, and you are applying the Markov kernel on every single of your states, and so they are moving forward, right? So they're moving around, and moving around. And so if you manage to create a coupling method, so like to form a joint distribution over all the possible instances of your states in such a way that at some point all the Markov chains collapse to the same point, right? So like they all kind of meet in the same position, right? Then you know that point is going to be distributed according to your target distribution, like perfect sampling. So you start from any arbitrary point, and then like you coalesce, and at coalescence you have a perfect sample. Okay, it's kind of like a well-known technique to some people. And now, like if you have to kind of enumerate all the possible states and propagate the Markov kernel through all the states, that would be very impractical, especially for large state spaces. And so instead of trying to do that, you just try to form a coupling that is monotonous, which means that the trajectories are ordered, so they never cross. Okay, before coalescence. And so you know that if the top one and the bottom one coalesce, then all the ones in between have as well. Okay? So if we look here, that's essentially what's happening. So we start at the max weight and the minimum weight. Right? So this is like this is L, I think. No, this is U. So my up and my down. All right. Then I just propose the same possible next step, right? And I use the same uniform to accept or reject, which means that the ratio of WU sorry, WB divided by W is always going to be upper bounded by that one. Make sense? And therefore, I'm always going to accept B for L more easily than I accept it for U. And that's true of any, I mean, and that keeps on being true. And so like the two chains are going to coalesce when they accept the same B, but they never cross, right? And that would be true for any ordered weights I start from, right? The weights the weights stay ordered. This makes sense. So it's like saying that W N is always less than W UN. You have this property. Okay, and so when they coalesce, you have a perfect sample. Right, and so that would actually give you a way to do perfect resampling using Metropolis Hastings, but without having to compute your sum. It's a different version of the independent one. For people coming from the past, like how long do you think it takes to get a sample?
Infinite expect to do that.
It'll be like,
No.
be like the rejection sampling, maybe with a log factor.
So that one, yes, yeah, I think so. You get some log n squared probably. Yeah. You can also do that kind of stuff with a random walk version, so like the one we had just before, right? So you can do the same thing with the random walk, but you have to pre-order your weights. Because now if you're proposing locally and like doing the random walk in the space of the weights, you need to make sure that like the way you do the random walk preserves the order. And so if your weights are not ordered, you can't do that. Okay, but that's like a bit more technical. Actually, I think it's n squared also for the independent sum. Yeah. And so if you do the random walk, you get a diffusive behavior as well. And so you would also end up with n squared as a computational time. Now you can also think of like better ways to do that, and the better way would be to use non-reversible chains, and you can still apply the same argument, and then like you would get something which is n rather than n squared. At least that's kind of what I think would happen, and that's why like it's a fairly interesting question to ask, at least.
So can I ask, what's the return value for the for
The return value, sorry?
what's the return value for the ends of?
Well, so when UN equals ln, then you said an equals UN. Sorry, I forgot that line. Yeah. So at the moment when they coalesce, this is your sample. I think you said it.
What if UN say is smaller than?
It cannot happen. It cannot happen by construction.
So you can sample Bn from 1 to n.
Yeah, but it's the same B. So you propose the same particle, and then you accept or reject it. If you reject it, then you stay above. If you accept it, then like one, so the L accepts B easier than U, right? So U typically doesn't move, but it's and then they coalesce. Yeah. So that's kind of like more freestyle, and it's more like open questions, right? Any remark on that? Like, remark? Just that's the. Oh yeah, I have that. I've forgotten. Nice. Nice. Because like it's probably easier to see it as a. Okay. So if you want to do like the Metropolis multinomial, you initialize your ancestors from 0 to n, -1 because it's Python. Then like your condition is just have I reached the given of the number of iterations I gave myself, and your loop goes at time t at iteration I. I look at the ancestors corresponding to my indices. I look at my log weights at the correct index. I propose independent ancestors, so like uniform between 0 and -1. I get a scalar uniform, and I accept or reject. So this is like a broadcasted. So it's something that is parallelized across all the particles. Then I just set the ancestors to the right value. Yeah. I think I have the killing one, and the killing one essentially like works roughly the same way. And so is it even implemented? Yeah, it is implemented. So it's essentially saying that if you have accepted already to stay where you were, then you just don't do anything. But otherwise, it's the same thing, right? And so you see, it's not that hard to code that kind of stuff, even though like it looks a bit overwhelming at first. Okay. All good. All right. Okay. So closing remarks. So the prefix sum perspective enabled us to parallelize all exact samplings, but even though they scale as log n, they have numerical issues due to the single half float precision, depending on whatever you want to do. And so instead, you can do something which is computationally fully parallelizable, but statistically it still requires like doing at least log n steps. So it's kind of like one of those weird, interesting moments when you like look at your algorithm, you say, okay, like it is fully parallelizable, but the complexity is actually log n or n, right? Because like statistically, you need to do it several times. It's one of those things that like if you're trying to think parallel, you need to think of that kind of. Okay, you need to be very careful about not stating that something is O of 1 or O of n, and forgetting about the fact that the method is less efficient. Okay. So we've not really discussed that, but moving the particles around and the indices around, it's not necessarily the best way to do it, and like there are implementation specific methods, like implementation details that enable you to do it properly. But also, if you were to do local MCMC proposals, then like you wouldn't have that issue in the first place. You would just like ask your neighbor, like, okay, just give me your value, right? And so it would be a bit easier.
Here you mean local in the indices.
Local in the indices, which is essentially local in the memory.
Yeah. As opposed to in space, is what I mean. As in like
Yeah, not in space, not in space. Yeah, so leaving you with a bunch of references. So the first, well, stuff that I've not discussed is distributed resampling, right? So we've been like thinking mostly SIMD, like the GPU context, but Anthony, who is probably like the most involved in those problems, has also like done some forest-based resampling, which is very useful for distributed settings. And fairly recently, the number 4, so Simon Maskell and his team in Liverpool have been working on actually implementing those massive scale resampling on supercomputers, right? So yeah, and so like this paper in MDPI is essentially a form of summary of the algorithm. it's a fairly hard paper to read, to be honest, but like they have the code, so yeah. And yeah, 3 is essentially what we've been talking about today. Mighty. Last section. Last section. So is everything clear so far? Yeah.
Francesca has looked into the folder, so very good.
Hi, Francesca. Wow.
Hello.
Right. So let's get back a bit to part of filtering, and let's look at the algorithm in a bit more detail. Right. Dependency of the resampling this time. So if you look at the SMC algorithm, you have proposal distributions. You compute your weights, you resample. You get over and over again, right? And now, like, you have some subtleties. So some people do adaptive resampling. Some people, but it's a bit unrelated. And that gives you a form of dependency graph, right? So you go from a distribution pi node, you apply a sequential importance resampling at step 0, it gets you to pi 1, and you go on and you go on and you go on, right? I've lifted that small chart from the distributed SMC, divide and conquer SMC paper. But another way to see it is as a recursive algorithm, right? So you say, if I'm at time 0, then my sequential Monte Carlo is just an important sample, right? If I'm at time t, I just need to do the SMC up to time t minus 1, apply a resampling, then propose my new particles, compute my weights, and return that. Okay. I've been trying to see if there was a way to make that. What's the name? To make that a tag recursion, but I'm not really convinced you can because of the resampling. Like, do you think it's feasible there? Like,
I haven't thought about it like that.
yeah. Because the problem is the resampling is something you apply after the SMC step, right? So like you get your importance weights, and like in a sense you could do the non-adaptive SMC, so the one you resample, the one where you resample all the time. You could actually probably do it in a tail recursion manner by doing the resampling before you return anything. But if you do that, then you're incurring a variance because you don't like using the last time step. Like you want the weights at the last time step. Yeah, and so that kind of like recursive perspective actually is useful when you try to think of tree structures rather than thinking of like linear structures. So when you have a form of dependency like this, you have like levels, right? So level 0 is something you can sample from, and then you push forward, right? So you go down structure, and so instead of like only working on the time indices, you can work on nodes, right? And so you can see SMC as a recursive algorithm on tree structures. That's a fairly nice way to think of it, in my opinion. And the idea is saying, okay, I have my tree, right? So like, just think of the one to the right. I have my tree, and the question is like, do I have any children? Right? If I don't have any children, then I just like do my importance sampling on myself. It essentially means like I depend on no one. Okay, I depend on no one, so I'm just doing my thing. Then like if you have children, then you query the particles and weights corresponding to your children. So you say, okay, like run your thing, give me your result, and once you've done that, you essentially combine them together. And so it's probably easier to think of it in terms of 2D than it is to think of it in terms of n-dimensional. once you have like, so you have x and y, two variables, right? And so you have phi of x, y. That's kind of like your phi. And you have n samples from x, xn. And then you have n samples from the weights of the x. So you have your samples from x and y, and you're trying to compute the expectation with respect to y. So this is what like samples of qx and of qy. Right. So you would essentially compute an importance sampling estimator of expectation of phi as 1 n sum, right, of phi of x n y n, and then q of x n x q y of y n, and then q x y. So you would compute an important sampling estimator like that. Yeah, that's assuming that x and y have been sampled independently. Okay, and so if instead of just getting the classical important sample, classical sample from it, you got weighted samples, then you would end up with something like this. Y and x. Yeah. Makes sense? So you end up with something like this. Right? And so now if you want a representation of your joint distribution of x and y, so xn yn, right? Then you just need to compute weights in front of them. Now the weights we just have here. So it's W n, which is W n times W n. It's proportional. Okay. And you can generalize that structure, that technique, to more than two variables. That's essentially what's happening here with the tensor. Right? So like those ICs are just in the indexing over the possible original children. Once you've done that, you have that like big tensor, right? So something, so W belongs now to the set of probability distribution of one. So say that there's the same number of particles, right? Okay. Now your tensor belongs to the set of probability distribution over like this big hypercube of indices, and you can sample from it, right? And that's what we do. We sample n times from it, right? And that corresponds to picking like n sets of indices. K, I have Cn, KCn, right? And so you pick n times Cn indices. All right, and that corresponds to the resampling step. Then you select, you set the children to their ancestor value, and you propagate through the Markov kernel. You compute your weights, and you do that over and over again. Okay. Just to go back to the standard importance sampling, you see the symmetric structure, right? It looks like a direct generalization of them. Yeah. Okay. Do we have questions about that?
Mention the very basic questions. with respect to the previous substructure at the start, they all work on general tree structures as well, I guess, or,
you need the topological ordering.
okay.
So if you
Direct tree to the job.
yeah. So like if you just take your topological ordering of your tree, you can fairly easily see that it extends it. There are better ways to treat PGMs, but I don't think the paper is out yet. I'm not on it. Not sure like what the status is. Yeah. Righty. So now that we've like tried to understand divide and conquer SMC in some way as like a direct generalization of particle filtering SMC, how can we use that to do smoothing? Right. So how can we use divide and conquer SMC to then like target the smoothing distribution directly? Okay, because here like if you just do particle filtering, you get a filter distribution, right? But we want to kind of like use the divide and conquer methodology to just do the whole thing at once and parallelize. Okay. So I'm going to be considering Markovian models. Okay, so like Markovian transitions, Markovian potentials. I don't think you can do better than that, or not easily at least. And so a realization you have, I'll just go to the next one actually. Something you can actually realize that your smoothing distribution splits, right? And that's thanks to the Markovian property. So if I give you an interval AB, and I just give you some form of like partial smoothing distribution, which is initialized at some arbitrary new distribution, right? I can split it in two at any point, at any time step of reference C, right? And I just tell you that this partial smoothing distribution is just like the distribution to the left, the distribution to the right, and then some stitching component here, like some stitching weight. Okay, you just do the math, everything cancels out, right? And you just realize that it's indeed the right, like the identity is correct. Okay, and so yeah, I'll go to the. Do I want to go now? Then yeah, maybe. So just like to show how this weight is implemented. So get weights. Get right. Labeled it. Nice, yeah. That's basically how you would implement it. Get log weights. Wrapped. Okay, so you just say like I have that weight function, which in my case, in my case corresponds to doing this, right? So I've kind of pre-computed it, and then I just do this VMAP. This VMAP operation. So it's that mapping operation, and I just do it twice because I'm doing it over like the particles at x time at time t and at time t-1, and that's essentially how I compute those matrices. I just think it's good to see like how you use those JAX primitives, independently of it being what we're talking about. So you can compose them as well. Like it enables you to compute matrices by just doing double VMAP. Right. So it's yet again, like it's the kind of stuff that looks very heavy to compute, but it's actually just like the composition of functions. Right. So so now, like once we have defined our once we have seen this enabling identity that I'm talking about, we can create a tree, right? That is a tree that acts over the powerful smoothing distribution. So we start from what we actually want to do. So we want to sample from that distribution. We split it in two, split it in two, split it in two. And at the very end, we end up with some marginal distributions, right? And some proposal distribution that is the one that we were considering in here. Okay, so we have kind of like a nice structure, a nice recursive tree structure on what we're trying to compute. So once you implement essentially divide and comparison on that kind of method, on that kind of problem, you just realize that you get some convergence results. Like there is a general convergence result that's due partially to Francesca and you and Cruz. Adam is on the paper as well. Johansson, yeah. And so that's a general result that essentially tells you that you never do well this time. And in fact, Francesca, it's the optimal rate, right? Like you get, it's the minimal variance estimator, isn't it? I think it is. I think that it's the minimal variance estimator, isn't it?
I can confirm that.
Okay. And so you also get unbiased estimators of your normalizing constant that you typically like to have in your SMC methods, right? Okay. But something that you may have noticed is this marginal problem, right? So like we have proposals that are separable across time steps. And so it means that if we have like a lot of time structure, it's going to be destroyed by that, right? And that's typically not something you want, and that's why SMC is, and that's why people like SMC so much, because you have like that proposal that depends on the previous time step, and so it kind of works well in that respect. And we need to kind of figure a way how to tackle that. Oh yeah, that was not in the right order. Why didn't? Okay. But okay, so like. By the way, for the smoothing distribution, we actually have more more fine understanding of the convergence rate compared to the general case that Francesca and Corenflos obtained. So we get something which is essentially the square root of n, right? And then some constant that splits across the left and the right hand side. And so if you run the recursion up to the final smoothing distribution, you realize that you apply this inequality log t times. And so essentially by the end, you realize that your rate is in t squared. So your convergence becomes worse quadratically with the number of time steps you want. And that is actually something that comes from the fact that you have separable proposals, right? And so we want to improve on that. Okay. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about, how you improve on that kind of stuff. But it's a bit useless if I talk about improving on it if we don't understand the problem that much. So is there any question on all that? No question. Is everybody clear about the method? Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Maybe to just take a moment. So the way it works is you will initialize with IID samples from an approximation of the Markovian model each time. And then as you go up, the only thing that happens, at least in the basic version,
is you kill it.
Okay.
Yeah. And so like by the end, yeah, so Matti Viola actually described it when we talked about it as a form of greedy sampler, where like you just sample and then you greedily destroy everything that does not correspond to your particles in the distribution. But yeah, it's like if I was to just draw what's happening, then at that's level 0 equals 0, 1, 2, 3. Good. So you get your particles. Here are the patterns. Right. You have independent particles. Then you say, okay, well, I'm going to form the particles maybe with significant between 0 and 1. So I'm considering them together, right? Forming this matrix of weights. Matrix of weight, right? Then I sample n times from that. And so now I've got like 2 time steps, but n trajectories. Right? So they now belong together. Yeah. And this specific matrix operation essentially enables me to compare to everybody to everybody. So I form all the possible trajectories between 2 time steps, and then I just take n. Okay, and same here. Here I get trajectories, and now because I put a Markovian property, I just kind of select those, right? Okay, and then I just pick n of them, which means that if I pick that one, I have to pick that one because they come together.
For the degeneracy of these paths, like can you comment on that? I didn't actually.
Yeah. Okay.
So in a way with SMC, the original version is you have Markov kernels and important sampling and resampling. And here you sort of don't bother with the Markov kernels, but you have the ability to take product measures.
Yeah, yeah, and that's kind of like it's statistically worse, but it's computationally better, right? And it's the kind of trade-off that you end up having to do. And the question is like, once you've done the trade-off, what do you do to make it better, right? Right, and so yeah, you keep on killing particles, and so you can realize that every level of your algorithm just has less and less representativity, right? And so like you start with a low representativity of your marginals, and then you end up with a very bad representation of your smoother. A big difference with the standard particle filtering is that the degeneracy is uniform in time. Right, so like if you look at the genealogy of a particle filtering, the degeneracy is worse at the initialization than it is at the last time step. Right, it's not really the case here because they are all being resampled log t times.
Just for clarity, the way you do that is things are equally bad everyone.
Yeah, equally bad. Yeah, not equally good. Right. Something that you might want to be able to do is just take a very big number of particles, but that's a very bad idea because memory, because like also it kind of ruins the point, like it breaks the parallelization, right? If you use your threads for the particles, you're not going to be able to use them for the time steps. Okay. And so like there are at least 2 strategies that can be used to improve on that. The first one is not published material. It's something I'm probably going to be working on next year, but we can discuss it if you want. The second one is conditional SMC, and there's already a few more things about it. Right, so who has heard of the resample move technique? Yeah, okay, just you? Okay. So in the standard SMC algorithm, we had this specific ancestor selection, right? So you resample and then you just stay there. Okay, you just stay there. So it means that you're kind of destroying representativity as you resample. Instead, if you have a Markov kernel that keeps the filtering distribution invariant, sorry, not the filtering, but the smoothing up to time t distribution invariant, you can apply it to your resampled trajectory and then kind of like regenerate the particles. And even if the kernel is not well mixing, it still improves the representativity as long as it keeps everything invariant, right? I think there are even results on the if you are contractive in the LP sense, there must be some good results that show that you're improving on the LP error.
The main stuff I know is the paper accidents.
Yeah.
So this kernel is applied particle-wise, right?
It's applied particle-wise, yeah, trajectory-wise.
Trajectory.
Yeah, so you give one trajectory and you regenerate it, and you can apply the kernel like k times or whatnot. But so it's actually something very expensive to do in the sequential world, right? Because like you have to kind of look at all your past observations, and every time you have to add one more, and so it ends up making the particle differing quadratic complexity-wise, all right? Because you have to like accumulate and go and compute everything. So some people have, well, in the original paper and also like in the review papers, they typically stop at a given lag, right? So you just stop and then like you keep the past unchanged, and that kind of improves the thing already quite a lot. But so in fact, it's fairly easy to see that you can do the same thing in the distributed, well, in the divide and conquer systems, right? And so if you look at your enabling identity that is like rewritten here, and I have, and say I have a Monte Carlo representation of this, so I've got n trajectories for that one, right? And n trajectories for that one. I can think of applying a Markov kernel that keeps that invariant to those n trajectories several times, perhaps, and then only then compute the weights. Okay, so the algorithm is essentially left unchanged, except that before computing the weights on the sampling, I just like run a Markov kernel that keeps the distribution invariant. Okay, and that's essentially a form of recursive version of this. All right, comfortable with that? Right, and I mean it's pretty clear that if this is correct, then that has to be correct, right? Okay, so
Yeah. So with the SMC version of the resample proof, as you say, you look at a fixed lag and focus on the most recent things. In this one, I guess you focus on stuff that's like at the nexus, like if you have this block of time and this block of time and you're bridging them together, then you probably focus on the time steps that are at the boundary there.
you do the whole.
You do the whole thing as well.
You do the whole thing. I mean, you'll see why in a second.
Okay, that's it.
And so, like, if you remember, we had one, right? We had a Markov kernel that kept our distribution invariant, and this Markov kernel also happens to be parallelizable across time. So this has a log t computational cost. All right. And so like if we quickly like just remember the structure, right? We have a tree structure where we've split left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, and each of and what we're going to be doing is like once we have a particular approximation of this, so n trajectories, we're going to apply a Markov kernel to each of the trajectories, and then like merge them together using the stitching weights. And so that means that when you are at depth d, you essentially have 2 to the power d distributions, right? So depth 0, you have 1, depth 1, you have 2, etc., etc. Okay, each of them has t minus, well, t divided by 2 to the power d time steps. I mean, if you have a balanced tree, right? Balanced binary tree. And then like a single iteration of that Markov kernel, but you can think of for the other versions of that, takes a log number of time steps to complete. All right. So now each depth has a complexity of order log 2t minus d. All right. Because like all the partial smoothing distributions can be done in parallel, and so I'm only caring about the sequential cost. I mean the prefix sum cost. Now, it means that if I sum all that across all depth, I just end up with a log t to the squared, right? Compared to the log t.
So when we talking about the complexity of it, we're doing the Kalman sweep.
So you would do like the resample move
using
that Kalman sampler, Kalman smooth MCMC.
For one particle, which is across time, but you have one
Trajectory.
Yes. What's the cost of doing one MCMC update on that?
It's log t. Well, it's log.
Is that the question that we're answering?
Yeah. So what you end up with is, so you have like a very long time sequence, right? Then you split it in two. Right there, that one you split in two as well. Yeah. Right, and so on and so forth.
Yes.
So now we know that like all operations happening at the same level can be done in parallel, and each. So here, like we have t. Here we have t divided by 2, t divided by 4, and essentially at depth d, we have t divided by 2 to the power. Okay, right? 2 to the power. Now we know that like Kalman stuff can be parallelized across time step, and so it essentially means that you can do one iteration of the sampler in logarithm of that. Yeah, so it's log.
So it's like the total
minus d log 2. Right? D log 2. Well, d because it's log 2.
So once you've gone into the full smoothing distribution of time capital T, how much time have you spent doing MCMC on the guy that got there? It's log T squared. Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Okay, and so you have like you are able to do resample move within that algorithm, which I think it's pretty nice. It's pretty nice, and you actually don't sacrifice as much as you would if you were doing it in the standard SMC. Right.
You have to assume that the missing CMC uniform reflected the length of the path.
The what, sir?
Missing the CMC
Uniform with this. You actually don't need to assume much in the resample. Actually, like even if the stuff is non-ergodic. Yeah. But,
and with me, the point but
all right. Worst case, you do several of them, but yeah, it would be an interesting thing to look at, like how many iterations you need, depending on the mixing. Like
that's good. I'm going to let it to blocking as well. So it's not going
blocking is a bit. Yeah, it's another kind of beast. And the problem with blocking is it's all arbitrary, like how you block. And,
yeah.
Okay. Okay. Another way to look at it is may need like half an hour more, I think. Is to do conditional SMC, right? So who's familiar with conditional SMC? So conditional SMC is it's an instance of SMC that consists in forming that tries to form a Markov kernel that keeps within distribution invariant, but does it a bit differently than what you would expect from an MCMC method, right? And so like if you look at your standard SMC method, you would expect to sample X naught from your initial distribution from 1 to capital N, right? 1 to capital N, and then like compute your weights. Then you do your resampling, right? Your resampling. Then after the resampling, you sample from the proposal distribution, compute your weights, and you keep on going. Conditional SMC is actually like a slight modification of that, where you keep one of the trajectories invariant. Okay, so you say I have a reference trajectory, which I'm calling x0 node t here. And I'm going to make sure that my nth particle corresponds to that. Okay, if I do this, and then like I sample from the backward either I just like look at the genealogy backwards, or I sample from it using backward sampling, whatever. Then this actually corresponds to a Markov kernel that keeps the target distribution invariant. So I've lifted the slides from Axel Finkel, which kind of explains what's happening in the sequential case a bit better than I would be able just like using words. So if I have a reference trajectory, which is kind of like my MC sample at iteration k, I am gonna sample a bunch of particles, and he uses 0 as the reference index, but I just presented it as n. I sample a bunch of proposals, and I set one of them to be the first value of my reference trajectory. So value at the first time step of my reference trajectory. Okay. Then I compute my weights, and I resample, but I resample in such a manner that I make sure that the reference one is not being killed. Okay. I just want it to be safe. I just want it to like be safe. Okay. Then I apply the proposal distribution, so the Markov kernel. I get a set of new particles at time t equals 2. I set the first particle to be the reference at time step 2. Resample. Yet again, I make sure that I keep the particle, the reference particle, unkilled, and I do that again and again and again. All right. So once we have that, we have a what you call the conditional SMT distribution. So it's particles conditional on one of the paths being something which is predefined. Okay. And to get a new path, so like to essentially sample from the target distribution, so to kind of like rejuvenate my reference trajectory, I'm going to go to the last time step, look at the weights. Where is it? So I look at the weights, and I pick randomly one of them. Okay, I pick one of them. According to the final weights, and then I just trace it back. I just say, okay, what was your ancestor? Who was your ancestor? Who was your ancestor? Who was your ancestor? Okay, and the red was the previous value of my Markov chain. The blue is now my Markov. Okay, so algorithmically, it's fairly simple, right? It's literally that thing that we had. SMC with one trajectory left unchanged. Okay. I think proving that it's actually correct is a bit hard. Yeah.
I think next one, say you just write it out. That's true.
Yeah, but I mean, it's okay. And so a natural question is, what do we do to emulate that behavior in the divide and conquer SMC context? Well, it's fairly easy. You just assume that you have two partial smoothing distributions. And by the way, that also extends to the general case of divide and conquer SMC. And you assume that it has a reference trajectory, right? So like in here, the nth trajectory is my reference one. Okay, and same here. You assume that, then you form your weights, right? You form your weights, and you just do you just sample n minus 1 times from the multinomial corresponding to the big matrix tensor, and then you just set the nth particle to just be like the trajectory you want to keep track of. Okay, and that essentially, if you just do that, you have a conditional SMC, but parallelizable. Yeah, it's actually not too hard to see it in 2D. Like in 1D, like the Moulin does it all the time, like the Andalduc and the Moulin, they do it all the time. Just like you do particle gips in one in one time step. Right?
Yeah, yes. I have reason to believe that.
Huh?
I mean, I have reason to believe that it's correct.
Yeah.
It was obvious.
No, I mean, it's not that obvious. Yeah, you need to kind of write down the extended distribution, but it's the kind of so like proving that these things are correct essentially is a bit technical, but it's technical in the sense of writing down the distribution of all the random variables that were generated. So once you've seen it, if you've seen it once, you've seen it, and you understand. But if you've not seen it, it's a bit hard to go through it. Right. Okay. Okay. And so like you can immediately use that, right, as a way to kind of regenerate your smoothing distribution. So you say, okay, I'm doing the smoother, and then I'm doing the conditional SMC in parallel, and I'm doing it over and over again, right? And so it doesn't require you to increase the number of particles, and you just keep on doing it. Right, but it's not necessarily sufficient. Particular, if you have high dimensional systems, then both the standard SMC and the parallel version are essentially going to collapse. So what happens when you have like high dimensional or very informative likelihoods is that your weights spike, right? And so you have a trajectory which is well situated within the right within the posterior. So like even say your reference trajectory is correctly distributed, you create a bunch of proposals around it, but the problem is their weights are all going to be zero, and therefore when you resample, you're going to be left only with your reference particle. You do that again, same thing again and again and again, right? And so at the very end, your reference trajectory and your new trajectories are exactly the same, and so your Markov chain is stuck. Okay, it's stuck mostly because like you have very high variance weights. And so yeah, well, that doesn't matter. And so a way to fix that problem is to use the same auxiliary variable trick we had we used a bit earlier. And the idea is to say, okay, let me augment my state space model with that auxiliary Gaussian, right? And then now I know how to sample from u given x. Okay, I know how to sample from u given x, and all I need to understand is how to sample from x given u. Okay, so I just need to create a Markov kernel that samples from x given u. And you just have to remember x given u is a state space model. So a very natural one is to use CSMC that we just defined. Either the sequential version of the parallel version, guys. Like don't think, just it's a CSMC. Okay. And so you can write down the conditional distribution, and so you have that in red. Everybody sees colors. So in red left, you have the Markov transition, which is left unchanged, and then you have a potential function in blue, which is kind of modified and takes into account the auxiliary variable behind it. Okay. Now, if you've ever worked with a SMC, you're going to tell me, Adrien, like, what the hell are you doing? Right? Because the problem with that is if I take delta goes to 0, which we did earlier because it's a form of step size, it makes your potential even more informative. Right? So like the variance of your weights is going to be even worse. So it sounds silly actually, right, to do that. I don't know about, but it sounds silly, right? To me, it does. But then what you can do is you can just like shuffle around, right? You shuffle around, you put the auxiliary observation inside the proposal rather than inside the likelihood, right? And so now you have a very informative prior and a very non-informative likelihood compared to the prior, if that is small. All right. So now that problem of having like spiky likelihoods that prevent you from moving is going to be completely erased. You don't get that anymore. Okay. Okay, yeah, and so here, something you would do is you would take, so if we go back to like our partial smoothing distribution, you would now take nu c to be exactly that Gaussian, right? So you sample a bunch of auxiliary variables at time step c, and now your proposal nu c is just that, right? And when you look at your weights, well, immediately the nu c cancel out. Right, and so your weight actually don't well, the proposal don't appear in the weights anymore, and because like if delta is small, all the x's are going to be like located around each other. Those weights are going to have fairly low variance. Okay, makes sense, right? Okay, and so if you actually like do a small back of the envelope calculation, you understand what's happening fairly fast. You look at your weights, right, either in the parallel or the sequential case. You do a small like Taylor expansion, right? And you say, okay, well, my XC minus UC are just Gaussians, right, with variance delta identity. And so I just look at the variance of that thing. Wave your hands a bit. I look at the variance. I'm just saying, okay, the variance of my weights are essentially delta squared, right? And so I can arbitrarily make my particle filter, parallel or not, as good as I want, in exchange for a form of locality, right? So I localize my proposal, so I don't go as far, but in exchange, my SMC is going to work. Yeah. Yeah. And that's essentially what I'm saying here. So you have that standard bias, like exploitation versus exploration. So for small delta, you're exploiting a lot. For large delta, you're exploring, but sometimes you just can't do anything. And so,
the delta, it should scale with the sort of complexity of the model in some way, but not necessarily with the time horizon. Or you think also with the time horizon?
I've not seen it have to scale with the time horizon. Because you do a form of buffer sampling, so that actually takes care of that.
If you have the particles somehow, yeah.
The buffer sampling actually takes care of the time horizon. That's the work of the
because that's not true a priori necessarily for the sales thing.
No. But in our case, it is.
Yes, yeah, that's great.
All right, and so like if you actually look at what it ends up doing, so for the same target acceptance rate, I think it was 50% for each time step. So like you calibrate that delta per time step. The standard, so like I'm looking at the square root expected square jump distance. So it's kind of like how much you move in average, right? Like the distance by which you move per iteration. You can see that the sequential version, so like the squares, is more efficient than the parallel version, right? So per iteration. But I've actually taken the number of time steps in that example so that they are exactly the same when you take into account the time takes, right? And so you actually don't pay any statistical cost for parallelizing, which I think is pretty cool.
Can you repeat the last thing?
So like, if you take into account the time that the sport takes to be generated, and you just like compare efficiency, but like when taking into account the time, you are not paying any cost.
Just tell us to go and opposite things.
Bye bye. Ciao. Right. Does that make sense? Right. So it's actually a very nice property. Like you thought you had sacrificed a lot of information by localizing, but then like you actually don't pay anything well, you don't pay much if anything at all. Okay. I mean, pretty much all the examples I tried, like it does so like
it's tutored
So if you apply that method, right, of like using those proposals, so it doesn't depend on the model, it depends on the proposal. Okay. So what we've been doing here is essentially like you sample from Gaussians around X, right, and then you sample from X given U, which is also Gaussian. And as I was mentioning earlier, this is an instance of the random walk metropolis things, right? At least like marginally it corresponds to a form of random walk metropolis things. But there is better things to be done, and in particular, you can consider gradient information. So if you sample U given X with some gradient information with respect to your smoothing distribution, and then X given U with a conditional SMC, then that corresponds to doing this, right? So like you sample U given that Gaussian plus gradient, and then you just want a kernel. And the kernel you want, again, like it looks like I'm doing something silly, right? Because this looks like it's gonna make the whole problem worse. But actually, you just reintroduce that Gaussian proposal, right? And compensate in the likely format again. And this is a way to generalize MALA to conditional SMC. Okay, that's something we're working on with Axel, I think. Yeah, and so that kind of stuff actually improves the ESS. Like all statistical metrics are dramatically improved by that, right? Because it's essentially MALA. We also have some stuff about this TP, which is Titias and Papasio plus for Gaussian dynamics or conditional Gaussian dynamics or SMC, but yeah, works really well as well. And so yeah, so that's essentially what it would end up looking like in the weight structure of your divide and conquer SMC. Make sense? Okay, closing remarks. That's the final closing remarks. So yeah. All right. So you can parallelize CSMC and SMC in time, right? That typically comes at a cost in terms of variance of your estimate, right? Like efficiency, variance, that kind of stuff. On the other end, they are unbiased. You have like convergence results. They are now fairly well understood thanks to the work of Adrien's team. So I want to mostly mention Johan Kunz, who sadly left academia. But this degeneracy problem, so for the smoothing itself, can be tackled. So I'm going to put like an asterisk here. I think, because it's something I'm planning on doing next year, with the resamplement technique, right? So it's like how you can actually get parallel in time, well-behaved smoothing distribution immediately. And in the context of the CSMC, you can use auxiliary variables to kind of rotate the problem and remove that high variance estimator that came from having separable proposals. What we have not been doing, and Sam mentioned it, is blocking strategies, which is the realm of smooth parsing, which consists in essentially using the Markovian structure in a bit of a different manner. And kind of like decomposing the smoothing distribution and then like sampling block by block alternatively. It's a bit like the parallel tempering with like even odd time steps. What we've not been seeing is divide and conquer for the filtering rather than the smoothing, so that exists. And we have also not been talking at all about distributed. And so everything was happening on the same GPU. Okay. Okay. So if you want to look into those things, this one has a bit more of my name on it. But so like the general method is in that JMLR paper, which is the first one. These auxiliary methods for both for MCMC and the conditional SMC are in the second paper. Plus, like there is a lot about like linearization methods and like how you can make all that more a bit fancier. Francesca and Adam have well, this filtering perspective on divide and conquer, which is to appear in Statistica Sneaker if it's not appeared yet. And the theoretical study of these auxiliary conditional SMC can be found in Substance. Excellent here. Alex. Right. So I have like, oh yeah, and of course like the first instance of divide and conquer SMC can be found in JCGS, and the blocking strategies is a paper in the biometric. Right. And I just want to finish on other parallelization techniques and strategies that I mean were a bit less relevant in terms of storytelling. They are really important, but like they didn't fit the story I wanted to tell. And so like you have interacting particle methods. So whereby like you run a bunch of SMC or conditional SMC or particle MCMC, and you make them interact together in a very uniform manner. So you run them independently and then you try and combine them whilst trying to not incur too much of a communication cost. Very interesting one for the base for health people, if I understand correctly, is the third one. So Anna, who also sadly left academia before an unfortunate departure, posted a paper on state space models that shared the same parameter. So that had actually been used to infer the rate of propagation of malaria in African population, but using different data sets. So you say, okay, I've got a data set for Western Africa, another one for like Central Africa, maybe another one in Asia. But we know that the biology is the same, and so the parameter should be the same. But how do we manage to kind of like combine the data sets to do inference on the parameter? So that's like a very different style of parallelization, because it's the kind of parallelization that you use to enable something to happen rather than like make something faster. But very interesting thing in itself. The only issue with it is that you need conjugacy, I think, but that's actually probably an interesting subject of research as well to extend it. Right. And otherwise, there is like a fairly recent line of research on debiasing via coupling, and that has been used to do smoothing as well. So it's an idea of like running two Markov planes together and using telescopic sum arguments to return unbiased estimators of expectations under the smoothing distribution. Very interesting as well. I mean, like I have some things on that, but not in the realm of smoothing. Yeah, and I think that's it. Yeah.
So much, Adrien. Any questions? I guess it was a quite interactive session. Any questions? Yeah.
Do you have any comments on the embedded HMM stuff that Neil said?
Yeah, the HMM on the shift to biophene.
Yeah, for example.
So like the MCMC, I think.
I guess it also blocks in time probably. I mean, it's a weird method because